Chapter 8 of Great Disasters and Horrors in the World's History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. Great Disasters and Horrors in the World's History by Alan H. Godbey. Chapter 8. Tropical Cyclones. The storm is on his way, with the lightning sword and the thunder shout, and his robe on the night wind floating out. The storm is on his way. The storm is on his way. He smites, and the death-swept valleys groan. The ocean rise, and the forests moan. The storm is on his way. The preceding pages show only the destructive power of the small tornadoes of our land. We are fortunate in that the great cyclone is, comparatively, a rare visitor among us. A moment's consideration of this ravager, as he appears in the tropics, will show how trifling are the storms that have swept over our own land. A few examples will convince the most skeptical. Of the great cyclones which have traversed our country in recent times, we may mention the hurricane of October 21 through 24, 1878. General Greeley says, "It first damaged buildings and sank vessels at Havana. It entered the United States near Wilmington, North Carolina, and moving due north, passed over Washington and eastern Pennsylvania, after which it curved eastward, and crossing New England, left the coast near Portland, Maine. In Philadelphia, over 700 substantial buildings were totally destroyed or seriously damaged, bridges injured, 22 vessels sunk, several persons injured, and 8 killed, entailing a loss variously estimated from $1 to $2 millions. Other loss of life and great damage by freshets and winds occurred elsewhere in Pennsylvania. A large number of steamers, ships, and coasting vessels were dismantled, wrecked, or sunk along the New Jersey, Virginia, and North Carolina coasts, entailing loss of life and enormous pecuniary damage. The wind reached 72 miles per hour at Philadelphia and 88 along the coast. Another cyclone the next year ruined 100 large vessels and 200 yachts and smacks. Another, in 1881, destroyed 400 persons along the Carolina coasts and damaged property to the extent of $1.6 million. But these are exceeded by the great Nova Scotia cyclone of 1873. The property damage alone is estimated at nearly $5 million. The Signal Service report says that 1,032 ships, of which 435 were small fishing schooners, are known to have been destroyed during the 24th and 25th of August, in the neighborhood of the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Atlantic shores of Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, and Newfoundland. On the other hand, over 190 vessels were destroyed by this hurricane in its passage over the ocean before it reached Nova Scotia, making a grand total of at least 1,223 vessels destroyed within a few days by its power. 223 lives are definitely reported to be lost, and the moderate estimate of the numerous cases in which whole crews have been lost swells this number to nearly 500. And if to this is added the loss of life on land and the loss in the earlier history of the cyclone, the grand total amounts to at least 600 lives. Had the famed Shah Jehan ever visited the West Indies, it is probable that he might have pronounced many of its lovely islets fit rivals for that beautiful creation of his fancy, which bore above the gateway. If there be paradise upon the earth, this it is, this it is, this it is. Among the loveliest groups are the beautiful Virgin Isles, and loveliest of these is the famed island of St. Thomas. A lofty mountain girdles the island, leaving an opening between two hills into a wide oval harbor, while the pretty little town lies around the inner side of the port, sloping up the mountain behind, the queen of a vast natural amphitheatre. Such a fine harbor has rendered St. Thomas almost the mistress of West Indian commerce, and one would not suspect, in looking at the sunny slopes and green-clad ranges around the azure harbor, that in this region is the birthplace of the Storm King. Yet not a spot on earth has been more frequently visited by great cyclones. One of the most notable of its visitations during this century occurred August 2nd, 1837. The barometer fell rapidly during the forenoon, and by noon the storm began. In a short time it increased to a tremendous gale. At about 3 o'clock the wind suddenly ceased. In a few moments it blew from the other direction, roaring and rolling black clouds before it, raising up immense sea waves, covering the island with intense gloom. 6 hours it blew, ever increasing. Tiles and slates whizzed through the air, to be shattered on the rocks or driven into timbers. Great trees were whirled about, often dashing away houses that seemed about to weather the storm, while the terrible roar of the wind was such that even the crash of the thunder could hardly be distinguished. One authority tells us that the great guns at the fort were blown through the air and tossed about the beach like chaff. This must be taken with allowance. It is more probable that the great guns on the beach were washed up from the wrecks of some old pirate vessels or ships of war. About 10 p.m. there was a slight cessation of the storm, and the people were congratulating themselves that the worst was over, when there came a violent earthquake, which laid in ruins almost everything that was left. The wreck took fire in 2 or 3 places. At once the hurricane began with renewed vigor, and ere the wretched people had fully comprehended the magnitude of the calamity, the whole ruined town was a sea of flame. Buffeted by the wind, blinded by the smoke and the pelting spray whirled up from the raging sea, the people ran for the slopes of the hills, the light of the funeral pyre of their hopes and labors rendering the gloom more horrible, and seeming to rival the gleams of Tartarus. Day broke at last. The storm was gone. The earthquake staggered the miserable folk no longer. The warm and brilliant sun of the West Indies smiled upon the scene. The whole country was strewn with large trees, uprooted or snapped off, and all plantations were destroyed. In the town the fire was dying out, and it was only here and there that the ruins were still smoking. The hurricane had swept away nearly all the wooden houses, those which had been lightly placed upon beams just above the soil being carried off as they stood, while the larger ones, which had resisted the hurricane, were overturned in an instant by the earthquake. The whole town was strewn with wrecks that told of the violence of the catastrophe. The port, so gay and animated the day before, was dreary and deserted, a few masts here and there emerging from the water, while all along the shore, and even upon the slope of the hills, were scattered wreckage and corpses of sailors. While we have noticed only the destruction wrought at St. Thomas, this storm was general throughout the Antilles. In the Bahamas it was less violent, they lying on the outskirts of the storm. Millions of dollars worth of property, merchandise, vegetation, houses, and vessels were destroyed, and thousands of lives lost. 30 years later St. Thomas again suffered from the combined forces of storm and earthquake, and the damage was greater because the earthquake, with its sea wave, came a few days after the storm, as the work of restoration was well under way, and so involved a second prostration of the resources of the people. Moreover, the town had grown considerably in 30 years, and there was much more valuable property to damage. 15 large steamers and many smaller vessels were driven on the shore by the storm, while the sea wave, a few days later, found the port again filled with vessels of different nations. It overleaped the sentinel hills at the entrance of the bay, and swept with tremendous force upon the city, drowning with its terrible roar the despairing cry of the sailors, then suddenly retired with the wreck of the city to its dark abyss. The batteries of heavy guns at the entrance of the harbor were swept away. A few injured vessels wallowed on the waves, but most have been swallowed up and left no trace behind. While there is always deep sympathy for those who suffer such calamities, yet it must remain of the type bestowed upon sufferers in Arctic expeditions. The character of the climate is well known, and the whole matter resolves itself into a question of the risk one is willing to run. There is no blind chance in control of these movements. The cyclone frequents only certain regions, and its habit and power is understood. While we pity the sufferers, we cannot assert that the scourge is mysterious or unaccountable, any more than we find mystery in the fact of eternal snow in the polar world. But there have been storms in the West Indies far more destructive than either of these, or both together. One of the most noted of the century is the famous Barbados storm of 1831, which an eyewitness thus describes. On the morning of the 10th of August, the sun rose without a cloud. At 10 a.m. a breeze that had been blowing died away. Towards 2 p.m. the heat became oppressive. At 5 p.m. thick clouds appeared in the north. Rain fell, and was succeeded by a sudden stillness, and a dismal blackness all around, except towards the zenith, where there was an obscure circle of imperfect light. Till 10:30 p.m., however, there was no sign of change. Then lightning appeared in the north, and very unusual fluctuations of the thermometer were observed. All this time the storm was only approaching. After midnight the continued flashing of the lightning was awfully grand, and a gale blew fiercely from the north and northeast. But at 1 a.m., on the 11th of August, the tempestuous rage of the wind increased as the storm suddenly shifted and burst from the northwest and immediate points. The upper regions were illuminated by incessant lightning, but the quivering sheet of blaze was surpassed in brilliancy by the darts of electric fire which exploded in every direction. At a little after 2 a.m., the astounding roar of the hurricane cannot be described by language. About 3 o'clock the wind abated, and the lightning ceased for a few moments at a time, when the blackness in which the town was enveloped was inexpressibly awful. Fiery meteors were presently seen falling from the heavens. One in particular, of a globular form and a deep red hue, was observed by the writer to descend perpendicularly from a vast height. On approaching the earth it assumed a dazzling whiteness and an elongated form, and on reaching the ground splashed around in the same manner as melted metal would have done, and was instantly extinct. It is evident that the coincidence on this occasion with the day on which the earth is known to pass through the August belt of meteors rendered the effect of this great storm at Barbados more striking. It is not safe to assert that there was any relation between the phenomena. A few minutes after, the deafening noise of the wind sank to a solemn murmur, or rather a distant roar, and the lightning, which from midnight had flashed and darted forkedly with but few momentary intermissions, now for nearly half a minute played frightfully between the clouds and the earth with novel and surprising action. The vast body of vapor appeared to touch the houses, and issued downward flaming blazes, which were nimbly returned from the earth upward. The moment after this singular alteration of lightning, the hurricane again burst forth from the western points with violence prodigious beyond description, hurling before it thousands of missiles, the fragments of every unsheltered structure of human art. The strongest houses were caused to vibrate from their foundations, and the surface of the very earth trembled as the destroyer raged over it. No thunder was at any time distinctly heard. The horrible roar and yelling of the wind, the noise of the ocean, whose frightful waves threatened the town with the destruction of all that the other elements might spare, the clattering of tiles, the falling of floors and walls, and the combination of 1,000 other sounds, formed a hideous and appalling din. About 5 a.m. the storm abated. At 6 o'clock the wind was at south. At 7 o'clock southeast. At 8 o'clock east-southeast, and at 9 o'clock the weather was clear. The view from the summit of the cathedral tower, a few hours later, was frightfully grand. The whole face of the country was laid waste. No sign of vegetation was apparent, except here and there small patches of sickly green. The surface of the ground appeared as if fire had run through the land, scorching and burning up the productions of the earth. The few remaining trees, stripped of their boughs and foliage, wore a cold and wintry aspect, and the numerous seats in the environs of Bridgetown, formerly concealed among thick groves, were now exposed and in ruins. One peculiarity noticeable was that in some places trees, timbers, and many other objects presented a scorched appearance, as though subjected to intense heat. The reason of this is not clear, as unusual heat was not perceptible after the beginning of the storm by anyone. It may be that this was produced by unusual quantities of electricity escaping through imperfect conductors, for we learn from other phenomena that during this storm there was an unusual state of electrical tension in the atmosphere. Sparks occasionally leaped from the heads of persons out of doors. Vast numbers of trees that were not blown down speedily died, and it has been suggested that an excess of electricity killed them. The total loss in this storm is not definitely known. Some further idea of its fearful violence may be gathered from the fact that at the north end of Barbados the waves broke over a cliff 70 feet high, and the saltwater spray was carried inland in such quantities as to kill all the freshwater fish in ponds far in the interior. As for the tremendous roar of the wind, the commanding officer of the 36th Regiment sought protection by getting under the arch of a lower window outside his house. He did not hear the roof and upper story of the house fall, and only found it out by the dust caused by the fall. Far more destructive was the great hurricane of 1780. The French and English were at war. Admiral George Rodney was in the West Indies with an English fleet in several divisions. The French had sent a convoy of 5,000 troops to Martinique. The storm was of immense width, extending from Trinidad on the extreme southwest to Antigua. The evening of October 9th was red and lowering. By 10 o'clock next morning the wind was high, and by 1 o'clock vessels in the harbors were dragging their anchors. The water was driven on shore with such force at Barbados that it was 4 feet deep in the government house. The family took refuge under the cannon, only to find that they were moved about by the wind. By morning not a building in town was standing. Every tree was either blown away or stripped of branches and leaves. The sunny islands were suddenly become as bleak and bare as a Siberian steppe. As to the loss, 10,000 perished at Martinique, 6,000 at Santa Lucia, 4,500 at St. Eustatia, 3,500 at Barbados. Scores of smaller islands were devastated, but the loss in detail is not known. Of the British fleet, the greater part was destroyed. Only one vessel out of 19 at St. Eustatia survived. A score of other ships of war and numerous transports were sunk. Of the French convoy, with 5,000 troops, the governor wrote laconically that it had disappeared. Several English vessels at Barbados were carried far inshore and converted into dwellings. Doubtless 50,000 would hardly be too great an estimate of the total loss of life in this storm. In a similar one in 1813 the hurricane drove back the Gulf Stream, piling up the water 30 feet deep in the Gulf of Mexico. The ship Ledbury Snow endeavored to ride out the storm, and when it was over, found herself high and dry. She had let go her anchor among the tree-tops of Elliott's Key. The Barbados region suffered another severe gale in 1782, when the prizes captured by Admiral Rodney were sunk. A number of merchant vessels and 2 English warships foundered, and 3,000 lives were lost at sea alone. The temperate zone has its occasional hurricanes, though they are by no means as powerful or as frequent as those of the tropics. It is stated that in the year 944, 1,500 houses were destroyed by a tempest in London. In the year 1090, it is recorded that a violent storm overturned 606 houses in London alone. Terrible as is the destruction of the cyclone in the Western world, its fury here cannot give a fair idea of the awful havoc it makes in Oriental regions. All through the Malay archipelago, along the coasts of China, Japan, the Philippines, Hindustan, and farther India, the ravages of the Storm King have been appalling, far exceeding even the terrible hurricanes of the West Indies. Hindustan affords peculiar facilities for destructiveness of cyclones. Both its great rivers flow, for the latter part of their course, through low alluvial plains, and their deltas extend into the ocean directly toward the region of monsoons, so that a hurricane may send a great tidal wave up the river, while the low rich plains for miles around are but few feet above tide water, and teem with a population attracted by the amazing fertility. So a sudden great storm may totally submerge, without any warning, hundreds of square miles of these fertile tracts, with all their inhabitants. Even when the sea wave is not added to the horrors of the storm, the losses are fearful. A cyclone at Calcutta in 1867 destroyed 30,000 houses, wrecked or sunk 600 ships and smaller vessels in the river, and killed 10,000 persons in the city alone. When to this is added the havoc committed by the storm, 100 miles wide, in the rural districts, as it traveled on toward the foothills, it is clear that every reader may be devoutly thankful that such terrible visitants are altogether unknown in our land. Terrible as this storm was, there was a greater one on the 5th of October, 1864. About 100 ships were lost, and over 60,000 persons perished, 43,000 in Calcutta alone. It was accompanied by a bore on the Hooghly, the water rising 30 feet, which is 10 feet higher than the highest spring tides. Whole towns were nearly destroyed. It indicated its approach for several days, and Captain Watson, of the Clarence, seeing the barometer falling, knew a cyclone was approaching, and saved his ship by steering out of its range. Compare this with the storms of our own land, that thrill the country with horror if but 100 people are killed, and remember that the cyclone of India destroyed 600 lives where one was destroyed in this region. Compare with the most terrible storms recorded in the West Indies, and the latter must yield. Coringa, on the Coromandel coast, has been several times desolated by these terrible storm waves. In December 1789, 3 immense rollers came ashore during a single storm. The town was destroyed, the neighboring country inundated. Ships were torn from their anchorage and thrown high on the land. 20,000 people were lost, and the heaps of sand and mud rendered search for bodies and property useless. In May 1833, the region at the mouth of the Hooghly was inundated by a cyclone. 300 villages and 50,000 people were destroyed. In June 1822, Burasel and Bakargunj, at the mouth of the Ganges, were overwhelmed, and 50,000 persons drowned. But Hindustan has far greater horrors to report. A terrible flood in 1887 was driven by the cyclone over the Ganges Delta. The victims numbered many thousands, exact figures not at hand. But in 1876, a cyclone swept the Bakargunj district and rolled in a storm wave over the eastern edge of the fertile delta, covering it with from 10 to 50 feet of water. When the storm had subsided, it was found that more than 100,000 people had perished. Finally, a great cyclone in 1737, October 11th and 12th, swept the Ganges Delta with a wave 30 feet deep on the land. 300,000 people perished in this storm. The mind cannot grasp the appalling magnitude of such a disaster. These cases are the most destructive cyclones on record, and in each case the destruction is due largely to the character of the region traversed, though the winds of Bengal are not surpassed in violence by those of any country in the world. Were the harbor an open seaport, instead of a large river, no ship could live through such a storm. Other regions in the east suffer much from tempests. The whole Malay archipelago, with the Moluccas and Philippines, are visited quite as frequently as the coast of Hindostan. A cyclone that swept the Philippine Islands November 6, 1885, destroyed 10,000 people and millions of dollars worth of property. The same character of storms is frequently met with in the Japan and China seas, where it is known as the typhoon, our anglicized spelling of the Chinese title typhoon. With one example of the power of this storm, this chapter must close. In the narrative of Commander Hall, of the British Navy, is found this description of a typhoon that occurred at Hong Kong, July 21 through 22, 1841. For days previously, large black clouds appeared to settle on the hills on either side. The atmosphere was extremely sultry and oppressive, and the most vivid lightning shot incessantly along the dense, threatening clouds, and looked more brilliant, because the phenomena were most remarkable at night, while during the day the threatening appearances were moderated considerably, and sometimes almost entirely disappeared. The vibrations of the mercury in the barometer were constant and rapid, and though it occasionally rose, still the improvement was only temporary. A storm was therefore confidently predicted. Between 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning, the wind was blowing very hard from the northward, or directly upon the shores of Hong Kong, and continued to increase in heavy squalls hour after hour. Ships were beginning to drive, and the work of destruction had commenced on every side. The Chinese junks and boats were blown about in all directions, and one of them was seen to founder with all hands on board. The fine basin of Hong Kong was gradually covered with scattered wrecks of the war of elements. Planks, spars, broken boats, and human beings clinging hopelessly for succor to every treacherous log, were tossed about on every side. The wind howled and tore everything away before it, literally sweeping the face of the waters. From 10:30 to 2:30, the hurricane was at its highest, the barometer at this time having descended to 28.5. The air was filled with spray and salt, so that it was impossible to see anything that was not close at hand. The wind roared and howled fearfully, so that it was impossible to hear a word that was said. Ships were now drifting foul of each other in all directions. Masts were being cut away, and from the strength of the wind forcing the sea high upon the shore, several ships were driven high and dry. The Chinese were all distracted, imploring their gods in vain for help. Such an awful scene of destruction and ruin is rarely witnessed, and almost everyone was so busy in thinking of his own safety as to be unable to render assistance to anyone else. Hundreds of Chinese were drowned, and occasionally a whole family, children and all, floated past the ships, clinging in apparent apathy, perhaps under the influence of opium, to the last remnants of their shattered boats, which soon tumbled to pieces and left them to their fate. On the 26th another typhoon occurred, but not so severe as the first. The storm at sea presents a class of peculiar dangers and a variety of thrilling experiences such as the landsman never knows. The stories of great shipwrecks and other purely naval disasters form some of the most interesting narratives in history, and doubtless the reader will be pleased to notice, in detail, the perils of the deep, and to learn of the precautions taken and the means in common use for averting, as far as possible, the disastrous results of the tempest. Certainly the brave tars who periled their lives on the ocean to bring us the luxuries of a foreign land deserve especial attention, and no apology need be given for devoting a portion of this volume to the story of their perils and daring. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois.